Welcome to the VCU ACE presentation, Back to the Drawing Board. Today we're going to talk about applying what we know to design an effective remote education for young learners. Today we'll be discussing the challenges of remote education for young learners. We'll also describe the current VPI recommendations for remote education. We'll describe how to integrate and adapt principles from parent-implemented or parent-mediated interventions for use with COVID-19 remote plans. We'll describe some considerations for different delivery options, and we'll be describing a case study family.
Hello, I'm Stephanie Paul. I am working with VCU ACE as a Training and Technical Assistance Associate. I have been an early childhood special education teacher previously for 18 years in the state of Virginia in a public school division. I also was a K-2 autism self-contained teacher for 4 years. As I just mentioned, I'm a Training and Technical Assistance Associate since 2014, and I'm also a board certified behavior analyst who's licensed in the state of Virginia. I've served on a variety of early childhood committees, including working on the scope of work for curriculum framework and with the Early Childhood Special Education Network. And I've worked for the past, 5 years now with Project PASS, which is an early childhood professional development model to work at improving practices, evidence-based practices for young children with ASD.
Hi, my name is Alicia Hart. I'm a training associate at VCU ACE, and I am behind the scenes in developing a lot of the content and products that you see from VCU ACE, including things like the Foundations of ASD course, the Parent Playbook course, all of our how-to videos, and a lot of our new early childhood videos. I also work with Stephanie on Project PASS, and as she said, that's a professional development program for early childhood teachers and related service providers. As part of Project PASS, I helped develop a lot of the training aspects to it. And in the past year, Project PASS has moved from an in-person training and coaching project to one that is done remotely. And so in the last year, we've transitioned to doing a lot of our training online. We do a lot of our live sessions through Zoom, just like we are right now. And we do a lot of our coaching remotely as well. That's been quite a transition, but it's also been something that helps us understand a lot of what's happening right now as schools move to using virtual and remote options. And so it really gives us some insight into how some of this works and how that you design it. I'm also a remote employee, except I live and work in Florida. So I fully understand some of the challenges to telecommuting and teleworking from home. I'm also a mom. So I am a parent to 3 children, Sky, Ewan, and Vaughn. Ewan was diagnosed with autism when he was 2 years old. So I have a lot of experience as both a professional in the field of autism spectrum disorders and as a parent raising a child with ASD. This is going to be important as we talk about working with families throughout this presentation, because it is an important consideration to think about how families are going to handle some of these changes coming this fall. My youngest son had brain surgery when he was 9 and had significant complications. So I also understand some of the challenges that families face when raising children with other disabilities. We really had a long road with both of my children. They are now older though, and they have been virtual students since 2013. While they are extremely independent learners now and require very little help on my part, I also understand what it's like to work full-time and transition to remote education. So I really, between Stephanie and I, we really bring a lot to this conversation about how that we're going to help support families and develop and design remote educational opportunities throughout this next year. When the pandemic hit last spring, we saw a lot of really big changes to the educational landscape. We saw a lot of creativity this past spring and teachers adjusting to such rapid changes in how we provide education for young children. And as we move forward in the fall, we really need to think about how we can apply what we've learned. Stephanie and I have seen some really creative solutions to connecting with families remotely. And we were really surprised to see teachers embrace such changes so creatively and so rapidly. Stephanie, do you remember what you've seen in the past few months as teachers tried to adjust?
Yes, I was very impressed with some of the different things that I saw that came out of kind of pulling together and all the changes in the spring. And I saw some pretty creative ways of tackling online and virtual lessons. Teachers that were going into their classrooms still now had to be videotaping from home and presenting sort of those a virtual pre-K classroom, and being very creative. Also using some different resources from websites, sending things to families. I think that was one of the things that we really saw as people pulling together and supporting each other, whether it was different coffee chats or different groups getting together within school divisions to try and really problem solve. What can we get out there as quickly as possible to help support this new kind of new normal at home learning with families, and any way that the teachers could be really jump in and be creative, they were doing such neat things, whether it's Classroom Dojo. I think Bitmoji Classroom. I've seen so many different things. Just really sending out, trying to send out little mini lessons. I think that, whatever platform they were using, they really learned very quickly, jumped on board, and really tried to send as many resources and supports out to families as they could in such a short pinch. If you think about how quickly schools closed, it really was a rapid turnaround and a lot of change going on.
Absolutely. Totally agree on that. It was such a dramatic shift, and teachers really stepped up and made that shift very quickly. As teachers adjusted to, trying to switch from in-person instruction to distance learning opportunities in the spring, we really saw a lot of stress too among families. They were really facing a lot of unique stressors, right? Such as unemployment, food scarcity in some situations, even if that's just going to the grocery store when the pandemic first hit and not being able to find certain canned goods, or, walking up and down some of the aisles and seeing some of the shelves empty, including toilet paper, yes, but there were lots of other things too. It could also be food scarcity in the sense that, families were struggling from unemployment. And so we really had a lot of economic issues, right, among families. We also had civic unrest. I always say I'm from the history department. So a long time ago, I used to study pandemics from a different perspective. And, whenever you look at outbreaks throughout history, the interesting thing is that it's never really just about the disease, right? There are so many other things that come bubbling to the surface during a pandemic. And so I wasn't surprised to see a lot of other civic unrest happening that didn't have anything really to do with COVID-19. But of course, we also have illness, right? We are dealing with a pandemic, and that means dealing with disease and how it spreads through our communities. And so a lot of our families were facing illness themselves, or, perhaps they had a family member or a friend who was in the hospital. And because of a lot of the COVID-19 restrictions, they weren't able to be with them physically in person and to provide them with that emotional support that they might do in any other situation. So it's really provided a lot of uncertainty. Whether it's uncertainty in our jobs, uncertainty in the foods that we shop for, uncertainty in how that our communities, just happen, how did they manage it and get through everyday situations, or even how they manage, more unique situations that cause a lot of civic unrest. And of course, we have a lot of uncertainty about this illness, right? Am I going to get sick? Are my children going to get sick? How can I keep my community and my family healthy in all of this? And so families not only were dealing with, the change in how education was provided, they were dealing with all of these other things. Of course, teachers were too, but, we have families who are trying to then switch from perhaps working in an office to working from home, and for the first time, supporting their child as they have to learn sometimes complex things. I can tell you, as a family member who works from home and has children who have been remote learners for many years now, it's not easy helping your child learn algebra or, how to figure out how to write a complex report. When you're at home, you're trying to juggle all these things, and you've not necessarily had the experience of being a teacher yourself. And so a lot of families were really put in a unique situation, and they're facing a lot of frustrations in helping teach their child while also working from home. So what we saw in the spring was, one of the examples was teachers sometimes sent out these really detailed learning packets that sometimes had a wealth of resources and activities for families to do. but they might not have provided families with the information they needed to support their child's unique learning needs. Now, I can tell you as a family member, as a parent of a child with ASD, I know a lot of things about my child. Sometimes I know more than maybe he does about himself, right? I have the unique perspective of living with his child since he was born, right? And understanding his unique needs throughout the lifespan. But that doesn't mean that I'm always able to fully grasp how to handle every situation with my son. So like if we're talking about how to teach algebra to my son, that's not something that I automatically understand and know what to do, right? There are going to be situations where even the best family who is the most knowledgeable about that particular child and about their needs, that they're still going to struggle with teaching certain things because let's face it, we're not experts at teaching for the most part. Most family members are not expert teachers. They've not had the background, they've not had the training, right? So we may know a lot about our child, but we don't always know maybe the instructional strategies that a teacher might use in the classroom to help engage or to help increase participation or to even just help teach them the actual thing that we're trying to teach, whether that's learning our colors and numbers when we're in preschool or learning more complex things like algebra and trigonometry in high school. We're really going to have to work to help provide families with the support they need to help teach their children at home. So what did families experience when they received these learning packets at home? Or maybe there were some other electronic, maybe there were digital classrooms that were created very quickly with Google Meet or Google Classroom. Some teachers got really, really creative with Bitmoji classrooms and things like that. But what did the family experience, right, in all of this? Whether they had the learning packet or maybe there was some sort of more complex virtual classroom. Well, I can tell you what I would have experienced if my son were 3 and going through this, right, as a preschool student. I could tell you right now, there's no way that my child would want to transition away what he is doing at home, one of his preferred activities, which at the time was Thomas the Train. There's no way he would want to transition easily away from playing with Thomas the Train to doing this activity that's been sent home by the teacher. I would have had a very difficult time engaging him, and he probably would have ran away, right? A lot of our children are struggling with ways to communicate, and if they can't communicate, are often going to use interfering behavior. My son Ewan used a communication device when he was 3. So there would have been a lot of communication challenges for him. And so I would have maybe had to program either the device that he used to have the vocabulary available for maybe some of the activities that might have been sent home. So let's just say one of the activities was to read Brown Bear with your child. I would have had to program some of that vocabulary into his device. I probably also would have used some of the signs for bear and brown and some of the other vocabulary that are in the book. And if Ewan couldn't have maybe communicated some of the things during that activity, if I'm asking him something about the story, trying to engage him in that process, he might have just given up and gotten frustrated because he couldn't communicate what he wanted to communicate at that point. He might have pushed away from me. He might have, depending on his mood that day, might have kicked me in the shin and ran off. So, families are really dealing with a lot of children who just didn't really understand what was being asked, didn't really know how to communicate, didn't really want to transition away from the things that they wanted to do, and really just didn't want to engage in the activity. And I'll be honest, that child probably gave up in a lot of those situations because the families didn't know how to support that child and getting them to the table, so to speak, to get them to participate in that activity. So what did the family experience? We just talked about what the child experienced, but what did the family experience in all of this? Honestly, as a parent, I can tell you there have been times that I've had really high expectations for my son, and there have been times when I've had really low expectations. And so there may be situations this past spring where families didn't really understand what the realistic expectation might have been, or they may not have had a really good understanding of their child's level of ability or understanding for certain instructional activities. So while families may understand their children in a lot of different ways, we're not teachers, right? So we don't often understand what our child's ability is for certain activities or learning experiences. And so we may not have known what to expect. It may have been too high of an expectation, or it might have been too low. We may have had difficulty engaging our child in different activities. Like I said, you have a child who has a really preferred activity at home. Sometimes it's playing with trains like my son, or sometimes it's just wanting to be outside in the backyard and swinging, or sometimes it's watching TV or watching movies, something that a child does at home all the time to relax. And all of a sudden, we're asking families to engage this child in a learning activity that would have been done somewhere else before, in the classroom before. So now we're expecting children to shift gears and to think of home as home and school. And so a lot of children may have just not wanted to engage in that, and families didn't know how to get their child to engage and participate in those sort of learning activities that were thought previously to be more of something you would do in the classroom. Families may not have understood how to actually support a communication attempt or to build on communication attempts for children that maybe have communication delays or significant challenges with communication. Families may not have known what learning actually happens in just daily, everyday routines and how to build on that learning. We talk about these teachable moments that happen all the time, and families sometimes have a good grasp on some of the things that they might want to teach about something they do at home. Maybe it's chores, or maybe it's something about teaching my child how to learn how to ride a bike, right? So we know how to build on some of those routines that are important to us as families, but we also don't sometimes understand how to build on just daily routines that can actually be connected to academic goals and things that we want to see happen in the classroom, right? So if we're cooking with our child, maybe that's something we don't really understand as a family, how to connect that to counting and measuring and color and all sorts of goals that we would just see in a classroom. And as family members, a lot of times at home, our children are doing the things that they like to do, the things that make them relax, right? They're playing a lot of times, or they're watching those movies that they like to watch, or they're playing in the backyard. And so it's hard for families to know how to move from something that's called like a child-led activity, where the child is, kind of engaged in something they want to do and they're good at and they're independent at, to moving to something that's more a parent-led interaction. Maybe that's the parents trying to engage the child in something that the teacher has sent home in a learning packet. And how do I switch gears from that child-led activity to that parent-led activity? And how do I, as a parent, have the confidence to lead this kind of activity when I'm not really used to being in this teacher role ever before? Stephanie, is there anything that you would add to that?
I think you covered it very nicely. The only thing I would add is I think one of the first things that we heard out of kind of the challenges that families experienced in the spring, one of the things that we kept hearing was, how do we support families in some of these new challenges, as far as like, my child is not able to kind of leave my side, so to speak. I have to be with them for every transition or things like that. So it was really a new way of looking at things, since the child has now spent more time than ever in the home, as opposed to those kind of classroom hours versus home. And again, looking at those routines, when do I need to help support my child? When can they do something independent? When can I actually get my work done at home? Because there were lots of parents, as you know, that are working from home, but trying to have this new challenge of sort of, I've got this child with me, by my side from morning to night. I really need them to learn how to do some things on their own, or when do I have the time, or who's around to help support? And I think that all of that really posed a challenge that we hadn't seen before, of course, due to the pandemic and being home more than ever. So it's not just, I think we think often about changes and how changes are so abrupt and what they can do for young children, but thinking of those families of, we've never really had to experience this before, and how do we navigate through this new time together, and how do we, support the child, but yet still go on with what we need to get done as people working from home.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. I mean, we have families who are trying to juggle so many different roles all of a sudden. They're whatever it is that they do at work. Maybe they're a manager, they are, they're able to work from home on a computer, but they're also a teacher now, and they're still a parent. And so we're seeing families having to juggle so many different roles in the midst of a global pandemic. So what did we see? Sometimes there were many situations where families just gave up altogether. If you're trying to juggle all these roles of, working from home, parenting from home, and now teaching from home, sometimes something has to give. especially if you don't know how to support your child as they learn through these new skills and they progress through their education. So families, probably focusing on a thing that was most important to them at the time, which is employment, staying employed. And so if you're working from home, that's probably your priority. After that, it's making sure that your children are fed and they're dressed and they're safe and they're not getting sick, and really trying to entertain them sometimes throughout the day, especially if we have really young children who are sort of attached at your hip and you're trying to maybe work on a Zoom call. And then, probably at the bottom of that list is teaching your child some of those new skills, and teaching them through some of the activities that have been sent home by that child's teacher. And so probably what's happened in a lot of situations is many families just simply gave up. But that was the spring. And now we're talking about fall and what's going to happen with schools as they either start to open for hybrid situations where we have in-person and remote instruction, or where maybe we're doing only remote instruction altogether. We've had some time since the spring. We've actually learned some lessons from the spring too. So what might we see this fall as we move forward? Well, there are a couple of different situations. First, we might see a teacher-directed and parent-supported learning situation. Well, what does that mean? That's basically when a teacher is working directly with that young child remotely. Perhaps it's with a TV broadcast. We've seen school divisions across Virginia use school broadcasts to actually reach the child. We've also seen teachers use things like Zoom or Google Meet or Microsoft Teams to do a live video conferencing situation where they can see the children and the children can see everybody else in the whole classroom, right? But when we're talking about children with disabilities, we understand that that's going to require some level of parent support for that child to remain engaged and to keep participating in the activity, especially when we're talking about a live synchronous session that might last for more than an hour. A lot of our young children with disabilities don't have that level of attention. And so we understand that that's going to be teacher directed, but parent supported. There may be situations though where we have a teacher supported and parent led situation. Well, what does that mean? Well, this is where a teacher might send home a learning packet, or maybe there's some activities that are online that the teacher has said, this is going to be a great activity for you to do with your child so that they can keep working on their educational goals. So the teacher provides directions. Sometimes those are really detailed directions for activities that the family can do throughout perhaps a whole week, right? But the parent must lead that child through that lesson or activity and know how to provide that necessary support so that that child will stay engaged and participate just like in any other situation. So we really have two situations here that we have to think about when we're designing instruction for the fall.
So as we move forward in the fall, we know there are current VPI recommendations. So we do know that about the fall. There might be some unknowns, but this we do know. So this is just a list of some of those recommendations. The first is to ensure that teachers or teacher assistants connect with students each school day through online instruction and or phone checkups. Also, ensuring that those meaningful interactions are taking place, so those two-way engagement with the student and staff. And that's going to also allow for that feedback and input. Full day programs are to provide a minimum of 2 hours of instruction a day or 10 hours a week, and at least 1 hour per day of health and wellness. So again, keeping in mind kind of what that routine as far as a classroom daily schedule will look like in a remote situation. Setting up a consistent daily schedule, as we know, that takes place whether you're in the classroom or not in the classroom. And so making sure to set a consistent daily schedule based on the majority of the caregiver's needs. So again, really taking into account that family and their needs, and offering options for asynchronous instruction and or activities that they can do with children. So aside from that time where there's the 2 hours or 10 hours of instruction, in addition, making sure there's asynchronous activities that the parents can do at other times with their child.
So how do we support families through all of these different remote educational options? Well, let's go through some of it. Really, the thing is that we're in uncharted waters right now. there's not a lot of research out there that talks about how to do remote instruction for preschoolers, because we know in-person instruction is really the best situation, right? We know that young learners really learn best when they're in person and having that social and communication exchange and being able to play with others. That's all part of learning as a very young child, right? So what do we know though? Some of the research that we know that can apply to this situation is called parent-mediated intervention. Parent-mediated interventions are an evidence-based practice for children with autism spectrum disorders. And it's a very specific framework that helps train and coach families to use certain practices in the home environment and with their children throughout the day, right? So we believe that in either teacher-directed and parent-supported situations or teacher-supported and parent-led educational situations, we can use that parent-mediated intervention framework to adapt curriculum, to prepare families, to support their child, to support families throughout the process, to use a variety of strategies that are really going to help their children with disabilities learn in this really unique situation. So what does that parent-mediated intervention framework look like? Well, it looks a little bit like this. And the first step in any sort of framework is to prepare, right? And so in a parent-mediated intervention, we would want to train parents, and not just, we're not looking at just parent education of a broad awareness of topics. We're talking about parent training with a specific systematic training process, right? And so we're going to determine which evidence-based practice for, in this situation for children with ASD, is the most appropriate to be used in a training package. And so, and then what order that they'll be in. So an example would be if we have a training package that is really heavily focused on social communication. We're going to really want to think about all the evidence-based practices that are going to be useful in teaching good social communication skills to young children with ASD, and in what order are parents going to use them in. So we might want to talk about things like prompting and reinforcement and functional communication and maybe even augmentative and alternative communication. But we also have to think about the order that we're going to talk about that in and the order that we're going to train parents in. And then in a parent-mediated intervention, we're going to want to meet with families, right? We're going to want to meet with them live. Now, there are some intervention frameworks where they do this in person, right? That's obviously going to be the most, the one that we're going to want to do the most often, right, is being there in person. But we also know that sometimes can't happen. So a lot of the research that we see with parent-mediated interventions, they're done remotely. And so some of that is done with a synchronous session. Some of it's done over the phone. Some of it's done through, video recordings. There's really a lot of different ways to connect with families. But the whole point is to meet with families in some way and really develop that same rapport and discussion that you would do if you were there in person, because you really got to learn how to understand this family's needs and their strengths and their abilities, and how that they can best help their child. And then you have to help families learn some of these new skills that you've picked out, right? Some of the strategies that you think are going to be the most helpful for this child. And so you really have to direct the family to really good resources that are going to help them figure out what these evidence-based practices are and how they can use them. If we think about prompting is a really good example of something that you can see, you can watch, you can learn about on, through a video, through some sort of, online training system, and then try to do it yourself, right? And so a lot of times that training aspect is going to be in an asynchronous, on your own, in a more convenient sort of fashion. How can families learn how to do that? Now, we have to take into account that this is real world, right? This is the real world where families are working and raising children and doing all these other things. So we really can't expect families to do some long drawn out training course that takes up hours of their day, right? And goes on for weeks at a time. We really need to find really targeted, specific, meaningful video training opportunities for families that they could watch and learn and apply what they've learned, right? And in applying what they've learned and really trying to practice implementing what they've seen in some of these videos, we want to observe the family to see how things are going, right? Just like any of us, if we've ever been coached through something, it's not easy to apply what you've learned without getting some feedback, right? So a lot of times we think we're doing prompting, but maybe there's some tweaking that we can do here and there to make this a little bit more effective. And so we really need someone who's an expert in that, or someone who's knowledgeable in it, to watch it and provide some of that feedback. So in this situation, in a parent-mediated intervention framework, and we're talking about something virtually, This might be something where families record a session where they practice using prompting in the home, right, and a daily routine. It might be something that you could do live in a session with Zoom or say Google Meet, but sometimes that puts a lot of pressure on families to wrangle a child in front of a computer and practice that skill that we've been working on. So sometimes video is the best one to do and submit that for feedback. And the feedback is going to be the same kind of feedback that happens in any kind of coaching, right? It's really good, concrete, written feedback that, talks about what that person has observed. Often we start with what's working, right? It doesn't matter who we're coaching, or if we're coaching families or if we're coaching our teachers in our building, right? We're going to start with what's working. And then we move on to some of the concerns or maybe some of the ways that we can tweak this and make this a little bit better, right? We want to be very specific in our feedback, right? Because really broad, generic feedback isn't helpful, especially when we're talking about how to do something like prompting, right? We really want to be really specific in what we see and how we can make that better. And of course, progress monitoring is a part of anything that we do, whether we're talking about parent-mediated interventions or we're talking about education in the classroom or remote education, right? Progress monitoring is always a part of this. Now, when we're talking about parent-mediated interventions and we're using sort of a virtual model, this may be more informal, and it may really rely on the family reporting on what's working and what's not. Okay, so we took you just through a really quick way of describing parent-mediated interventions, and we've talked about this in other presentations, so we're not going to go into it at length here. But that's the framework when you think about parent-mediated interventions and doing it virtually, right? But the thing is we want to move beyond intervention. When we think about parent-mediated interventions, we're using really specific evidence-based practices, especially for children with ASD. But we want to move beyond that, though. We want to talk about how that we can support families doing some of these, parent-directed or parent-supported remote educational opportunities, right? And we're going to have to include a lot of different strategies beyond just some of the evidence-based practices that we might see for children with ASD, right? We want to think about all children and all children with disabilities. And so we really want to think about how that we can help support families to use a variety of intervention or instructional practices that can include things that help encourage engagement, help support and encourage communication, and really support learning overall. So how can we apply what we know, right? Let's apply what we know about parent-mediated interventions and the research that's behind that, and apply it to what we're trying to do right now and design some of these really remote instructional opportunities for young learners. And there's not a lot of research on that, right? So we have to take what we have out there. So it's not perfect, and we're overlapping a little bit here, but let's see what we can do. We can apply what we know about some of the parent-mediated interventions and adapt it to this. And the first one is to adapt, right? We are going to have to consider that curriculum and adapt those plans and activities for remote teaching situations. Stephanie can tell you that that's probably not the easiest thing in the world, right, Stephanie?
Yes. So that is something that I think has been a challenge, right? Teachers are really effective at taking their curriculum and making lesson plans, but how that translates over into remote education or providing that to families and what they're going to do, whether it's looking at some of the different, whether it's a hybrid model or synchronous, asynchronous, and so forth, it really makes for a challenge to see how am I exactly going to take what I used to do with that curriculum in the classroom now and provide that for that child at home. And in that set of circumstances, in that environment, and so forth. So really looking at how do I take this and adapt those plans for remote teaching situations.
And the thing is nobody's an expert at this right now. Everybody is struggling, right? Especially with preschool. We know preschool is best when it's done in person. And so there's really not a lot of guidance on how to do this. So it's not going to be perfect at first. There's going to be lots of bumps. There's going to be lots of lessons learned from this process. But there is a way that we can start to think about how to do this in a bigger framework, right? And so we're thinking about, we're going to look at our curriculum and we're going to figure out how we can adapt this so that families can support this or families can help lead some of these activities. But the next thing that we're going to do is consider individual IEP goals, right? We're going to try to apply these goals to these remote situations. Now, I know Stephanie's going to tell you here in just a second that applying IEP goals, even in the classroom, takes a lot of thought, right? So how do I work in these goals throughout different activities and routines in the classroom? Now we're going to have to start thinking about how can we apply all of those goals and all of those learning objectives to these remote situations. And that's not going to be easy. Stephanie, what would you say about that?
So it is of course challenging when you're in the classroom as a teacher, even though you have that skill set, right? And you have, this is your craft and you know how to do this as a special educator. That's what you went to school for. One of the things that I think has been the challenge, but needs to take place, right, is if you're modifying or individualizing instruction for a child with disabilities when the child is present in your classroom, you also should be doing that and providing those directions for parents and families as they implement any home-based activities, whether it's a learning packet, whether it's an independent activity, whatever it is. And that's challenging, right? Because educators, especially having, special education background and their pre-service and so forth, that's what they learned how to do. And so taking that and providing that individualization and sort of handing that off, if you will, some of that to parents is going to be a challenge. And I think that that's one of the things that we really have to keep in mind as we move forward in the fall, that this continues to need to take place, right? Those children need those learning opportunities more than ever. And so how do you do that? How do you take and make sure that you're individualizing those directions, those instructions, that activity, and really relaying that information and helping to support the family through that?
And that's really the next step, right? Is to prepare families for all of this, the rest of whatever is going to happen. However we've adapted this curriculum, however we've changed some of the activities that we've done for some of these remote situations, however we've considered the IEP goals and how we're going to apply these to all of these remote situations. The next part is to prepare the family for what's going to happen next, right? Because they're going to have to support their child's learning goals using a wide variety of strategies that they're not aware of, right? Families aren't teachers, right? They're often not trained to be teachers, right? So they don't know what you know. You have a wealth of instructional strategies at your fingertips because you've been trained to do so. Families don't have that training. And so now's our time to prepare and think about how that we're going to support families to do this and how we're going to support families to learn some of the skills that you know. Now, we're not going to make teachers out of these families, and they're not going to be masters at this right away. But there are some things that we can do to share with families to help this be more successful. The next part then is to teach, right? So we've done all of this prepare work and we've adapted and we've considered and we're figuring out how we're going to support families. But now we've got to figure out, okay, how we're actually going to do some of this. How are we going to actually teach some of the children doing some of the remote learning opportunities that your district has decided on? And that's going to look different from school division to school division, right? So sometimes every building is going to look different. Sometimes every county is going to look different. What one state is doing is going to look very different from what the next state is doing. And so it's really going to be based off of what your plan is for your school division and your school building and your grade. Preschool is going to look a lot differently than, say, high school, right? There's a lot more considerations that preschool teachers are going to have to think about versus, say, a high school teacher. And of course, with any framework, whether we're talking about parent-mediated interventions or we're talking about remote learning, there's going to be feedback and there's going to be progress monitoring, right? We're still going to want to observe families and children in these live sessions and allow families maybe to submit some video clips of what they're doing so that we can give them some feedback, right? And again, it's going to be that concrete written feedback that helps families move forward and do better and to make things, little tweaks here and there to make some things a little bit easier for their child. And of course, progress monitoring in a situation like this is not going to be easy. Still a critical component, but it may be an informal process for now, given what's happening with COVID-19. So we went through a lot really quickly there, and I think we need to stop for a second and break things down a little bit more, because we do have two really distinct situations that may happen this fall, right? We may have that teacher-directed, parent-supported learning situation, and we may have that teacher-supported, parent-led. Now, let's start with teacher-directed, parent-supported. Now, I know we're throwing some really new terms at you, right? There's not a lot of terms to describe what we're doing. So we've had to kind of create some. This is where we think the teacher is going to be doing some direct work, speaking directly to children, whether that's through a TV broadcast or an online video conferencing, live session. But this is where the teacher is really working directly with children. And parents, because we know that children with disabilities are going to require some support to keep engaged and participating in some of these activities, this is where the parents are going to come in and support this. So in this situation, again, we're going to start with the curriculum, no matter if we're in a classroom where we're talking about in-person instruction or we're talking about some of these remote situations. We're always going to start with the curriculum. And we're going to have to adapt, right? We're going to have to adapt those activities, and we're going to think about what we can do remotely with children and how that families can support this. And of course, we're going to bring in those IEP goals, and we're going to guide the individualization of this, because we're not just going to have this umbrella where everybody's doing the same thing. There has to be some individualization, because if you're going to have IEP goals and you're going to individualize in the classroom, you're going to do it remotely too. There's no difference here. But there are a couple other things we want you to think about, right? Beyond the curriculum and beyond the IEP goals. Because parents, if they're supporting this teacher-directed learning opportunities, they still have to understand what the expectations are in this situation. They still have to understand engagement and how to encourage that with their child. They really still have to facilitate communication, whether that's facilitating communication between their child and the teacher, or even just facilitating their child's understanding of what's being said, or maybe they're facilitating some augmentative communication systems for their child. It doesn't matter if this is in, a teacher-directed remote situation, or this is, parents are trying to figure this out on their own. They still have to know these three things, right? They still have to know expectation, engagement, and communication, and how they can support all of those things for their child. We also have those teacher-supported and parent-led learning situations where it's not a live session or it's not a TV broadcast, maybe where the teacher's speaking directly to the child. This is where the teacher has provided some sort of activity, whether it's in a learning packet or maybe it's through online, an asynchronous situation where this is beyond that live moment where the teacher has given some direction and now the parent has to take over, right? And so this is a teacher-supported, parent-led learning situation. Again, same thing as the last time. We're going to start with the curriculum. We're always going to start with the curriculum. How can we adjust and adapt and tweak that for families to use on their own, right? And of course, we're still going to include those IEP goals because it doesn't change. Those haven't gone away, right? Just because it's not teacher-directed and it's parent-led in this situation, those IEP goals are going to stay there. We're going to have to really provide some concrete ways for parents to support their child's IEP goals, right? Families aren't teachers. So they really need more than maybe just a little sentence here and there. We're going to really need to provide some detailed, concrete ways to support that. And we're going to have to include not just that expectation, engagement, and communication piece, but we're also going to have to help parents and families understand how to embed learning throughout the day, right? So we have two extra pieces here. We have embedding and leading. So when we think about all of the learning that happens throughout the day at home for children and families, we want families to understand the importance of those daily routines and the learning that happens, but also how to embed that throughout the day, right? So Stephanie, I know that this has become a really big thing in the last few months, is how do we help families understand how to embed learning throughout the day? And this is not as easy as it sounds, is it?
No, it isn't. I think that, at times whether it's, you're in your own home as a family member and you don't think about all those daily routines and really what you can teach through them. I think even thinking of my own situation when my children were young, all those teachable moments that you kind of talked about earlier, how it's really important to capitalize on those, right? And really letting the family recognize you are, give yourself some grace. You are getting some learning done through those typical or those naturally occurring routines. And sometimes saying, hey, where can you add a little more to this? Or could you add some more communication, situations where you kind of sabotage or set something up? Where could you do that naturally within what you do in your home? Because everybody runs their home differently, right? But I think it's sometimes just getting families to be able to realize, oh yes, that is going on. And where could I maybe, where do I need to support the child? And where are there times also where that child, I'm working on them, being more independent or being able to do something on their own. And we're kind of helping to guide and help families to realize where that can take place. I think sometimes that was where we started, right, in the spring too, with a lot, as we talked about, use your, one of the things we heard over and over, whether it was in the media or other places, was, keep your routines, because, especially young children, thrive on those routines. Well, yes, that is so true, but also thinking, wow, these are lots of areas where I can embed those teachable moments in a natural way, right? Not where we're sitting there and it's very contrived and so forth. Taking what you're already doing, whether it's those wake up routines, whether it's, getting dressed in the morning or preparing breakfast or whatever it is that you're doing with your young child within the home. And how can you add in those, not even just those curriculum pieces or those pre-academics, but IEP goals, right? And where could that occur and how can parents support those goals?
Absolutely. And I've said many times already in this presentation that families aren't teachers. They're not trained in the same way that you are, right? But at the same time, families and parents are a child's first teacher, right? And so sometimes this is about reminding families that they are able to help their child learn in really natural ways, right? Sometimes we forget just what you can learn in some really routine activities, like we said before, cooking and even cleaning and chores and all of these things. There's some really good things that children can learn. And a lot of this is just about reminding families what's really there. Now, on that last piece on leading, right? So families, maybe they haven't thought about themselves as a natural teacher before, or maybe there's some reminding that we can do, right? But families are really going to need to be able to lead some instructional opportunities with confidence. And that's not really easy, right? It's one thing to lead your child through a daily routine that's a part of your everyday life, right? So whether it's cooking or chores or any of that stuff, right? We feel pretty confident because we know exactly what we're doing, right? We know how our family rules and our family life unfolds. But now we're asking families to think about these really sort of formal learning opportunities, to stop what they're doing and, like Stephanie said, sit down and do this contrived situation, right? This is a little bit different. And families may not have that confidence to do that, right? And so we're really going to have to think about ways to support that family to lead these opportunities, lead it with confidence, and understand how that they're going to engage and keep their child participating throughout this activity. There's a lot we can do to help families lead these activities with a lot of confidence and a little more understanding of what their child's needs are throughout that activity. So there are a lot of strategies that we can do to help families with each one of these things, with expectations, with engagement, with supporting communication, with embedding learning throughout the day, and leading activities. What are those strategies? Well, let's think about that. What strategies are going to apply to both of these situations, teacher-directed or parent-led? So let's think about this. A lot of these are the same instructional strategies that you use in your classroom, right? Now, we're not going to make teachers out of family members in the first week, right? Now, we're not expecting you to teach family members how to do each and every one of the things that are on this slide. And actually, Stephanie and I have had some really long talks about what are the most important ones on this slide that might be the most helpful for families. And we could all come up with probably different ones that we think are the most meaningful. So when you think about teaching in your own classroom, obviously everyone starts with that universal aspect, right? What can we do to support engagement and participation and access for all children, right? So the same thing is going to apply for how we think about this remotely, and how are we going to help all children, no matter their abilities, participate and understand and engage and communicate through some of these remote learning opportunities. The same thing is going to apply. So we still have to think about representation, engagement, expression, and promoting access and participation for every student, no matter their ability or disability. But there are other targeted and intensive instructional strategies that we also consider, right, Stephanie? Like, which ones would you talk about here?
Right. So when we think of targeted and intensive, of course, we're talking about not the majority, or not what you're going to do with the whole class. Again, that's going to be a specific amount of students according to their needs. And so those supports and instructional strategies in that targeted region, I think what we already talked about, embedded learning opportunities, because of that quality and intensity of instruction, right? That's going to need to be there for particular students that have those goals. And then working on environmental adaptations. I think, there are some, we as educators, that's one of the first things we look at. How do we adapt this environment to promote learning, right? To promote that engagement, to promote participation, all those things that we want to see so that learning occurs. I think that's really important. I think that's still one that you would want to address and hopefully be able to provide some type of training on. Again, knowing that it's not going to be, a month-long class or so forth, but what can you do to help support that, those environmental adaptations that are going to need to occur in that home, right, for the child to be successful. I think also looking at task analysis. That's one I think that often gets overlooked, right? We might look at, okay, again, looking at those expectations of students, maybe they're only going to be able to do, a couple of steps in an activity that's sent home. What is that going to look like? How do you help break that down? Because it'll be important, those skills that have more complex steps or multiple steps, how do you break that down? And so that it can be as concrete as possible, and that the child, it's attainable, right? And where one child, if a lesson is sent home, how does the family break that down so that it's doable? And again, so they're not giving up. How can we do that and make it more simplistic? I think that's a really important one. The ABC looks at those antecedents, those behaviors, and the consequence, right? What do we want? Well, often this is for people misconstrue this as observing behavior and taking down data on interfering behavior. What we really need to flip and get all those involved in that learning process to know is this is how behavior change happens. This is how learning occurs, right? We set up those antecedents. We want that targeted response or behavior. And then the consequence hopefully is reinforcement. Very powerful tool to hope to make behavior change and learning to occur. So I think that that's a really important one, is looking at that and kind of flipping it into the positive and not always looking at, we're taking ABC data. And so how do you kind of relay that into what you do in a classroom into now this remote educational experience, whether it's, teacher-led or parent-led. And so those I think are the most important. Modeling, I think, you talked about sending home, or doing videos. I think that's a really powerful way to help with modeling. Modeling's so important, right? A lot of kids will have imitation skills so that they're learning. And so it's important that as the child is also working from home, that they are able to have skills modeled for them. And how do you do that? It doesn't come naturally necessarily for everyone. I think that, again, your families and educators, everyone's going to be at a different level as far as what they know about modeling or how to go about it. And so I think those would be the ones that I would pick out the most out of the targeted list. In the intensive area, those tiered supports that are intensive, and again, we're talking about probably a very small percentage of young children that are going to need these types of supports, but that systematic instruction, very important, that it's happening in a very step-by-step way. And so that's, I think, going to be one of the most important ones there. Again, I think it's really getting to know your student and obviously knowing those individual goals that your student has, the supports that they need, and those adaptations, whether that falls, hopefully, you're as an educator, you're providing at all different levels if needed for students that require those instructional strategies and supports.
Now, when we think about how to apply what we know with parent-mediated interventions to this process of, really teaching remotely, is the next step is preparing families to support this child's learning goals using a variety of strategies. Now, we just talked about a lot of different strategies on that last slide, but I think one of the most important is task analysis. We want you to keep thinking about how to break things down into smaller and smaller pieces so that whether we're talking about families or children can learn this new thing, right? And so we're talking about families, no matter what form remote education is taking here, they're going to require some form of training support in order to implement any strategy that we've talked about at home. And so when we think about breaking these things down into really small pieces, that's where task analysis really comes into this, right? But we also need to think about really short but powerful training resources, right? We really need some meaningful experiences for families. And we know that the adult attention span of any American right now is pretty short, right? Even we're not talking about a pandemic. We really, we're talking about 5 minutes or less when we're talking about videos. But right now, when our attention spans are just so drained because of all the other stressors that we have in our lives, we really need things to be very targeted, very specific, and to be honest, pretty short. Families are working from home, they're raising their children from home right now, and of course they're trying to teach their children from home or support teaching. And we really need to honor their time and value their all the challenges that they're facing right now. So we really need these short but powerful training resources. And we need a lot of our video resources to model different strategies so that parents can see what this looks like. So a good example of this is reading a story, right? When you're reading a story in the classroom, there are specific things that you do to help engage children in reading that story. So in telling a family, oh, one of the activities you're going to do is you're going to read Brown Bear, Brown Bear. And a family might be thinking, okay, I can do that. I've absolutely got, reading a story down. But there are some elements that help engage children in that process and help encourage participation and pointing to different things and modeling different vocabulary that we really want families to focus on. And so sometimes showing them that in a video can be really powerful rather than just saying, read this story with your child. You might want to say, here are some strategies to support engagement and participation as you read this story to your child. You can also include really concrete step-by-step written directions, but make sure it moves beyond just reading the story. We want to really share some good strategies and tips for engaging that child. So Stephanie, I know you know some of these resource training options really, you understand them really well and very familiar with them. Can you go through some of the resources for Universal Design for Learning?
Yeah, so one of the things that I talked about earlier is being on some of the committees with curriculum framework. And luckily, one of the nice parts of that is that we've been able to look at some resources that we find helpful for educators that we also feel families would really find helpful as well. So for UDL, so Universal Design for Learning, here are just a few training options. Again, we really try to look at things that were engaging. So, videos, short clips, that really talked about what is it, how do you do it, why, but in a really short, concise way. So the ACTA Center has a video, and also the Office of Head Start and Connect. So we try to find kind of not a whole large list, but really keep to short videos that were concise and specific on that topic. And these are early childhood examples as well. So you can go and find resources about Universal Design for Learning, but they aren't necessarily early childhood specific. So we want to make sure to find those, few, maybe not an exhaustive list, but it's nice to have more of that targeted look at, exactly those examples you want to see in an early childhood program.
There's also some resources too that Stephanie has come up with for both targeted and intensive. Do you want to start with some of the targeted resources, Stephanie?
Yes. So again, the Office of Head Start has some nice, short, concise videos on targeted interventions. So looking at that kind of those instructional strategies that are user-friendly and that would be also appropriate for families to view. So the National Professional Development Center on Inclusion has some video resources on embedded instruction and naturalistic teaching. The Affirm modules, those are really, they're more intensive as far as the step-by-step and the materials, but they're very thorough. So I find that those are very valuable resources as well. And of course, you can pick and choose whatever one. So if it's on prompting or so forth. So there's a variety of those, but I believe the one that we put the link for is to prompting on this one. Our website at VCU ACE, we have several how-to videos that are going to look at those different targeted practices, whether it's modeling, reinforcement, task analysis, different things. So we have also nice how-to videos. Those seem to be the most popular ones, I think, because they are short and concise, and again, tell you kind of what it is, how do you do it, and the why behind it. So also the autism internet modules, those are very helpful training resource tools that you can find a plethora of instructional strategies from prompting, naturalistic teaching, task analysis, systematic instruction. So lots of videos as well, examples in there. So there are modules that you can take on a specific instructional strategy, and then they're, it's self-paced. You can come in and do as you will on your own time.
And of course, we have some of the intensive resources as well. Stephanie, do you want to talk about some of those?
Yes. So again, we were talking about that these are, looking at those supports and instructional strategies that are going to be probably for a, small amount of the population of young children, but very helpful as well, whether it's looking at functional behavior, some of, reinforcement, looking at that ABC in more depth and being able to understand and get some training on that. So we have at VCU ACE, not only do we have how-to videos, but there's also fact sheets and so forth on behavior, functional behavior analysis, behavior intervention plans, things like that. We know that that's always a hot topic, and those are the things that people want to get more information about. The Affirm modules, again, there's a whole list of them, and you will be able to find more of those targeted training, again, the very concise, specific topics that you would like to see or to be able to provide training for families on. The last resource link you'll see there is from the National Center Pyramid Model Innovations. And so that's more on some tip sheets. And also I believe there's a video there for looking at challenging behavior specific to young children.
So let's move to applying what we know and applying it to all of these different remote teaching opportunities that are all going to be different, right? Everybody's plan is going to be different. It may look very different from one district to the next, from one building to the next, from one grade to the next. But what are some of the options that we might see? Well, right now, some of the things that we've seen in the spring and what we've heard people talking about for the fall include learning packets, using TV broadcasts, using synchronous or live sessions like a Zoom session, using asynchronous learning opportunities, and perhaps some sort of mix or a hybrid of all of these, right? So let's go through each one of these and talk about the benefits of them and talk about some considerations as well. When we talk about the benefits of learning packets, well, one of the obvious ones is we have really concrete directions and steps, and families can look back at this again and again to say, well, wait, what am I supposed to do today? These can also be really convenient for families. This allows families to use this and do it at their own time, at their own pace, and try to mix this in with their own responsibilities, right? We have families who are working from home potentially, or perhaps have really demanding work schedules if they're an essential worker right now. And so this allows families to do this when it is convenient for them. And sometimes maybe that's in the afternoon or the evening. Some of these learning packets can also include resources for the lesson that is talked about or the activity, right? So this might be, including some of the reading selections, or, there may be some situations where schools are able to provide other resources that may include like paints or blocks for play activities. There's really a lot of options when we're talking about learning packets. There are also some considerations, though. When we're talking about equity in any of these situations, there's going to be some concerns across the board, right? So for each one of these situations, we're going to have some concerns about equity, especially for children with disabilities here, because if we have this written learning packet that's sent home, most of the time we might be seeing some things like that are pretty generic, oh, parent-child interactions, children love doing activities like this, you shouldn't really have any problems engaging your child. But when we're talking about children with disabilities, there may be some more in-depth information that we can provide families to help encourage engagement or to help them understand what to expect out of this. And so we really need to think about how that we can adapt that learning packet to include more information, maybe perhaps about that child's IEP goal, or maybe about ways that include how to engage and communicate and learn for this child that are really specific. We can also include video links for families when we're talking about modeling and helping families see what some of these things look like, or maybe we're helping the child learn and see what this looks like. We can really include video links in that learning packet. So it helps them move from just this concrete learning packet to something that's a little more engaging and online and help provide a little bit more information. You also want to think about considering adding a live session to this, right? Doing a learning packet alone may not be enough for families who are raising children with disabilities. They may need a phone or video conference that allows them to have more interactive opportunities with teachers to discuss concerns, ask questions, and get some feedback. There's also a lot of benefits to using a school broadcast on TV. For one, these could be recorded by families and watched at different times throughout the day when it is more convenient for them. And maybe it's not in the middle of one of the Zoom sessions they have to do for work, right? So perhaps it's something that could be recorded. It also allows a lot of teacher-led activities to, for the child to watch and try to engage in. It could potentially be used to help model things for families as well. Some considerations when we talk about equity and alleviating some concerns of equity for children with disabilities, I would say one of the things we might want to do is add in some written support for families that are raising children with disabilities. Because in that TV broadcast, you may not be able to address some of those individual IEP goals or ways that families can support engagement and communication for their child. So let's provide some in-depth written support to go along with this as well. You can also model strategies for families that they may need to use with their child. Maybe we're talking about reading. Earlier we said reading sounds like a really easy activity for families to do, but if we really want to encourage that engagement and communication and develop some more skills, there may be some more unique ways to present information as you're reading, right? So this is a great way to model that for families and show them what you want them to do after they've left this session, right? Now, we're asking children to watch more TV, right? We know that this is going to add screen time to their day. So this means that we want to caution families about using screen time for the rest of the day. So if we're doing 2 hours of a school broadcast on TV, that's 2 hours that we want to subtract from some of the other time throughout the day so that we're not adding to that screen time total overall. We're not asking families to get rid of the TV altogether, but we want to ask them to consider some of the, limiting that time throughout the day. Again, we may want to consider adding a live individual session with a family, phone or a video conference, whichever we can manage, so that we can create those more interactive opportunities with the child and the family, right? We want to be able to assess more individual, interactions with both of them. Then when we talk about the benefits of synchronous or live video conferencing sessions, we talk about the ability to have these real-time interactions, right? So when you're having a Zoom conversation with your colleagues or with families, you really get to have that back and forth, right? This is a real-time interaction where it's a back and forth conversation. Yes, it's virtual, but it is still a conversation. Now, we can also have whole or small group, synchronous sections. It doesn't have to be the whole classroom. Maybe it can be a small group. There's a lot of really unique features on Zoom and Google Teams that allow for some of these breakout sessions. We can have child-to-child interactions. The school broadcast is a great idea for, addressing some concerns with equity in terms of technology. But, some of these live sessions really allow children to communicate with each other, and they haven't maybe got to see them for a while. I know that I've seen some families comment about how excited children are to see each other and how lengthy of conversation that they've had about the type of pancakes they had that morning. So it really allows children to interact and socialize with each other, given the circumstances that we have here, and it's making the best out of a bad situation. It also allows children and families to ask questions and get immediate feedback from teachers. So there's really a lot of benefits from these live synchronous sessions. There's also some considerations though, including concerns with equity, right? We're talking about, does everybody have access to technology and data and internet plans? What are some ways that we can think about how to address that given your division's plan? There may be some needs that we need to think about in terms of training families to use technology. I'll tell you, there's a lot of times that Stephanie and I plan to practice how to use a lot of the gear that we have in Project Pass. And so as we've moved our professional development project into a more remote or virtual situation, we've had to practice a lot using Zoom or some of the remote viewing devices that we have in the classrooms. It's not as easy as it sounds sometimes to connect with all of these different platforms, and they all have their own quirks, and they all have their own features. So, you know, you really have to become familiar with each different platform that you're going to use. So before you get in there and jump in and ask families to use it, make sure you know how to use it, but then prepare families to know how to use it as well. And so I know Stephanie and I have created a lot of task analysis for our teachers in Project Pass, and we've broken down step by step how to turn on some of the devices, how to access some of the programs that we'll be using, and how to connect with us virtually, because it's not always easy. And of course, we still have to consider the challenges of engagement and attention and participation for children with disabilities. We're asking a child with disabilities who may not want to sit in front of a computer for 2 hours to sit in front of a computer for 2 hours, right? So this is this can be challenging for a lot of children. And if it's challenging for the child, it's going to be challenging for the families to support. So we may need to think about some of accommodations that we may need to make. We need to really also consider the pressure that we are putting families and children under when we are expecting them to do a live session as they learn or do an activity together, right? So in some situations, perhaps you're viewing a family as they've learned how to implement something, right? You're going to give some feedback during this live session. Well, that puts a lot of pressure on that family to really perform this new skill that they've learned, right? And they're performing this instructional strategies that they've learned about, right, with their child. Then they've also got to wrangle their child and get them in front of this computer and the webcam at the same time. And so think about the pressure that we're putting families under on that. We may want to consider using video submission where it's more easily convenient and recordable for families to say, like, okay, I've got a few extra hands right now. I've got some time to do this. This is a really good moment to record this. Let's try to record this, do what we're asked to do here, and show the activity, and then send this in for some feedback. And of course, we also want to consider follow-up opportunities that allow families to ask more meaningful questions and to seek feedback. Because if we're doing all this in a live session and we're throwing a lot of information at either a child or a family, they may need some time to process that information and come back and say, wait a minute, I actually had some questions about what we talked about in that live session. So make sure that you have some sort of follow-up opportunity with that. So you've had the live session, you had a lot that the family may need to process, give them some time to think about it, and then come back with some questions. And then, of course, we have asynchronous options. Asynchronous really just means that we're allowing some sort of self-paced course, right? Or self-paced option for learning. These are really convenient because they allow you to do this when it's beneficial for you, right? So if you have a lot going on in the morning because of work and you're working from home, this allows you to do this in the afternoon or the evening, whatever works best for that family's schedule and that child's schedule. They're really flexible usually. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, you can do this part now and maybe tomorrow you can do the next part of this, and you've got the whole week to complete some activities, right? It also allows families and children to review information as needed. So I can tell you, as a parent of a child with ASD, I also have some characteristics myself. And one of those is processing information in the moment when there's a lot of things happening. So if I'm distracted by some sounds in the environment, or my dog's running around, or my neighbor's mowing their yard, sometimes I have a really hard time concentrating on that information. And I really need to go back and review it again later. The same is true for a lot of families. We're all under a lot of pressure right now, and we're all under a lot of stress. And anything that allows families to go back and review something after they've had time to process it, or to say, wait a minute, I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to be doing here. I should go back and watch this again. Especially if we're asking families to do any sort of, you know, practice some sort of instructional strategy and use this in real time in their in some sort of activity that they're leading, or as they're supporting a teacher-directed opportunity. Parents may need to watch this before they go into that. Like, wait, what does prompting look like again? Wait, how am I supposed to do this? This helps them makes this information more concrete and something they can use in the moment. And of course, there are considerations for asynchronous options as well, because we still have to discuss equity concerns, and we have to address lack of technology, data, or internet. We have to do that all in accordance with your division's plan. We still need to consider training for families to use this technology, because I'll tell you, a lot of the learning management systems out there, like Canvas or Blackboard, they're not always intuitive. Sometimes they are, and they're getting better, but there are still some things that we're going to help families with when we're in terms of logging in. How do I access that information? What if I have some problems, getting to a video that's been included? So think about ways that you can train families and maybe even answer some frequently asked questions. You also want to think about the challenges of collecting data on child engagement and performance when we're doing an asynchronous option. We can't always track what's happening as people go through these learning modules. So it is something to think about. You also want to consider follow-up opportunities for families because they've had time to look at this information. They've had time to review it. But now they may have some questions. So there needs to be maybe some sort of, either it's email, maybe it's a phone call, maybe it's a live session that we add into that so that families can ask questions and really get some feedback on some things that they've learned. So when you think about hybrid options, this is where we bring everything together. It could just be that you're talking about a synchronous and asynchronous session you're putting together, but it can also include learning packets, school broadcasts on TV. You can really bring all of these things together to make a hybrid option so that you can address some of the concerns with equity. This really allows families the best of all these worlds, right? It gives them time to digest information. It gives them time to develop really meaningful questions and concerns that they have. And it also allows for those real-time interactions. There's really a lot of good things to think about in terms of combining any or all of these. So some of the considerations when you're talking about hybrid options are really the same things that we had before, right? We all have concerns with equity with any of these situations. And in combining them may address that. And it also may address some of the necessary accommodations that we're gonna have to make to family work and life circumstances. Because if you're relying only on a synchronous session where parents are expected to support their child through 2 hours a day, that just may not be feasible for some families who are working from home, and especially if they have meetings during that time and they don't have flexibility with their work schedule. So you may want to consider all of these options so that we can help include some of those accommodations. We also may want to combine some of these to include really individualized information so that we can address those IEP goals. Some situations like that school broadcast are not going to allow us for that individualization. So we really need to think about ways of combining that to address all of these needs. So now that we've talked about all the different situations that we might have in terms of teaching or remote learning opportunities, let's just quickly go over feedback and progress monitoring, right? So feedback, just remember, it gives us a chance to observe the family, observe the child, see what's happening in the home, and provide some feedback and some guidance on how to maybe tweak some things, or what they can do next, what they can expect next. And of course, progress monitoring is a part of every program, no matter what we're talking about. And it's always a critical component. But this may be an informal process for now, and it may rely on supporting families to understand how that they can help this process at home. So we've talked about a lot of things really quickly, and it's really foreign territory for a lot of us, right? So you're probably thinking, how on earth do I put all of this together, and where do I even start? Well, we thought we'd start with a case study. This might be the most helpful way to move forward. So Stephanie and I thought the best way to go about this is to maybe do a case study with my son, Ewan. As you remember, I said Ewan was diagnosed with autism when he was 2 years old. And I've collected a lot of information about Ewan over the years, and I've saved a lot of things about him. I have binders and binders full of information. And yes, I still have Ewan's IEP goals from when he was when he was 3 years old and in preschool. So I looked back and I thought, well, what were his goals at the time? Some of them were about weighting and turn taking. Some of those were about understanding basic concepts like on, off, under. Sometimes it was colors. It was about using a 2 or 3 word utterance. If you remember, I've said before, Ewan used a communication device at the time. He used a high-tech communication device to help him speak. He did still have some verbal skills though, and we were really trying to encourage him to use both the communication device and verbal speech. So at the time, some of his goals were to include a 2 or 3 word utterance, as well as using his communication device. We also had goals of following a 2-step direction. And of course, because he had autism, he also had goals with parallel play and playing with others. We also wanted to think about what would it be like if I had 3-year-old Ewan now in the context of a pandemic and all these other things. So what we really did was we took what would be like our family life be like if we had 3-year-old Ewan and my 10-year-old daughter at the time and my 1-year-old son, Vaughn. And we were trying to manage all of this in the middle of a pandemic. So of course the situation would be, I would be working from home full time like I am right now, but I would have 3 children at home. My husband is an essential worker, so he's gone for most of the day. And when he comes back, he's exhausted and he's really not able to do a lot in terms of, kind of the helping at home and helping with the children. And so at the time, Ewan's brother would only be 1 year old and his sister would be 10. We would have just transitioned from early intervention. So we would have some concept of, embedding some learning throughout the day and using routines that we had learned from early intervention. We also would have had some strategies that we had already been learning, like using augmentative communication, using visual supports, the importance of schedules and routines, but there was still a lot that I needed to learn at the time. I had some knowledge of ASD, but I certainly wasn't what I am right now, right? I wasn't leading, professional development opportunities in, evidence-based practices in ASD. So I still had a lot to learn at the time. At the time, I would have said, Dad is, if you combined today with then, he would be very tired, but he liked to play games with his kids and he liked to do that. That was something that he really enjoyed doing, and that was a strength for him. I would have also said that I was tech savvy and my daughter was tech savvy. So we would have had some, familiarity with technology, and we would have been pretty good at incorporating that into our daily life in some way, shape, or form, even if that included remote learning opportunities. So there are some challenges here, but there are also some good things as well. So I asked my husband, if you were to sit down and try to imagine our life when Ewan was 3 in the middle of a pandemic where we're being expected to handle a lot of his preschool through remote learning opportunities, what would that be like and how would you handle it? And he said, I come home around 2 o'clock every day, so I could maybe help with some activities, but my job is physically demanding though, and I'm really tired. And he said, I just don't know how I would have the time or energy to get 3-year-old Ewan to sit down in front of a computer or a TV to watch a live session, especially if this is going on for an hour or so. At the time Ewan was 3, he was a perpetual motion machine. He was constantly in movement, unless it was something that he really preferred, like playing with Thomas the Train. So I can imagine my husband's concerns about trying to wrangle this perpetual motion machine to sit down and focus for even 30 seconds, let alone an hour or 2. And then, of course, I'm thinking about myself and all of this. What would life be like if I had 3-year-old Ewan now, as I'm working from home full time in the context of the middle of this crazy pandemic? And I would say, I do work from home, yes, and I have some experience working from home, so I'm pretty good at that. And I have really some flexibility in when I work and getting some projects finished. I'd also say I'm pretty good at supporting Ewan to use his communication device, and I'm pretty good with using visual supports, but I'm still not sure, even knowing all the things that I knew at the time and being familiar with a lot of things, I'm still not sure how I would get Ewan to sit and do a lot of activities or watch a live session for too long. Given all that I know about everything that's happened in the pandemic thus far and my workload and how things have been, while I may have some flexibility, I don't have total flexibility. We still have a lot of things that we need to get done, and sometimes we need to get them done quickly. So I still have, as a work from home telecommuting employee who's raising 3 children and try to do all this virtually, I still have to consider, how am I going to get all this done in one day, right? So there's still some considerations I have and some concerns about doing some remote learning. Okay, so where do we start? Remember, we're applying what we know about parent-mediated interventions, and we're applying it to all of this designing remote opportunities. So we've already adapted the curriculum for a remote learning opportunity. So let's think now what the next step is. Stephanie, do you want to take us through that?
Sure. So when you look at this process and you look at that second step of considering, we need to really go back to, again, you've already mentioned that curriculum. We know what curriculum we're using, and we've looked at that and how we're going to adapt that for remote learning. But now we really need to consider, what are Ewan's IEP goals? You had that nice graphic of those different goals. And so really going back to and making sure that those individualized goals are guiding that instruction.
Another thing to think about when we talk about IEP goals and considering a child's IEP goals and talking with families about it is making sure the family truly understands what these goals are and what they mean. I've sat in many IEP meetings, and I've been there as the whole table is sitting down and working on developing different IEP goals. And sometimes, I will say from my perspective, sometimes they're not as important to me as they are to the teacher. The teacher is the one who's going to have to address some of these goals in the classroom. And of course, as a family member, I'm not there to do that. So I think when we're talking about moving to remote instructional opportunities and remote learning, we want to really make sure that families truly understand what these goals are, what they mean, why they're important, and how this helps them get to the next step. We really want to take some time to explain IEP goals and make sure the family's comfortable with this, because this is where we're going to start. We're going to start with these goals, and they're going to guide the rest of this, of how the family supports their child and how their child progresses through this. So let's make sure that families really truly understand what's happening with these goals, what they are, why they're important, and what's going to happen next.
So now that we've talked about considering UN's goals and that within the family context, right? We want to really look at how do we prepare the family to support UN's learning those goals, right? Working on those goals. What is the family familiar with as far as instructional strategies, or what are their strengths? And then what are they going to need to help to work on those goals? Because some of those are complex when you look at whether it's using 2 to 3 word utterances, parallel play, what is involved in that? Again, thinking about task analysis and prompting and some of these instructional strategies. It's one thing to be able to model, but then to maybe know more about an effective instructional strategy to support the teaching of that goal will be really critical. So how do you kind of gather and prepare so that you can help to perhaps provide, whether it's short, concise video resources with training on those specific instructional strategies that are going to help when working with, as Alicia mentioned, UN worked with an AAC device. It might be one thing, to model or to prepare or to be able to kind of use your tech skills that to prepare that. But then how do you really go about, whether it's prompting or breaking a skill down? Maybe those are areas that you need to help to prepare the family of what are they going to need to best support you and teaching those specific IEP goals to him.
Then, of course, when we think about considering accommodations for this family, I'm going to say, yes, I do have some flexibility in working from home. And of course, my husband comes home at 2, but he's pretty tired. So if there is a long morning session from, say 8 to 9 or 8 to 10 or even longer, how are we going to be able to juggle all these different roles of working from home, just parenting from home, and then of course trying to support my child as he learns through some of these different types of learning opportunities. And so there may be some accommodations that can be made. Yes, maybe UN can do some of the live sessions, and maybe we can really work hard to encourage his engagement and participation in those, but it just may not be possible. When you have that perpetual motion machine who's constantly wanting to run around, it's going to be really hard for me to get him to just sit and want to watch this, whether it's on a computer or a TV. And so we may want to consider some accommodations for that family and using some of those different options. Remember, we talked about hybrid options where we include a little bit of everything, where we've got learning packets that can make up for some of the time that he can't participate. Maybe there's those recorded sessions where it's something where we can come back and watch this later or watch it in chunks. So if you have a live session, can you record that and share that with the family so they can maybe do that later in smaller bite-size, activities or time periods? Or is there ways that we can do some things on our own or try and embed this throughout the day? How can we really bring this together and create a truly hybrid situation that really has the accommodations this family needs to succeed? And of course, we still have to consider ways for UN's family to provide feedback. Now, as I said earlier, myself and my daughter were pretty tech savvy at the time. And so we would have been able to, record videos on maybe cell phones or iPads, or maybe even the old school video camera, upload that and share that with a teacher so that we could get some feedback on what we're doing. Sometimes that can be in a live session. Remember, there's a lot of pressure that we put on somebody when we're asking them to do something in front of a computer with a young child all at once, right? So consider maybe having a couple of different options where they can record, and maybe you can check in with live sessions as well. Now, when we're thinking about some teacher-directed, parent-supported learning situations where perhaps there's either a school broadcast on TV or there's a live synchronous session where the teacher is leading this, remember that I'm still going to have to support Ewan as he does this. And as I've said many times already, he's constantly in motion. So how do I even, address this all together? When I'm sitting here thinking about, maybe a block of morning time where I've got to engage Ewan in something here, I don't even know what to expect, to be honest. And I'll be honest, probably I've got some low expectations of what's going to happen here. And so, Stephanie, I would say that the teacher's role is probably helping, families kind of gauge that expectation based off what they know about the child in terms of assessment and some of their goals. Don't you think there's some middle ground that we can find in terms of helping families with expectations?
Absolutely. I think there are ways to help manage the family's expectations, and as the educator and kind of knowing the whole picture or the whole story, just as you kind of laid out for us in that case study, I think that's a really important and valid point of how do you do that, right? How do you kind of you build rapport and you work with families in order for them to kind of gauge, yeah, maybe these are too high of expectations. So probably the best way to do that is sort of to pose some questions. So I bet the best way to kind of lay this out, I think, is to really work through what we've had in the case study and look at some questions. So in helping to manage those families' expectations, some of the questions you may want to pose are, what are Ewan's abilities and goals? We want to know what are the current level, right? That current level of performance or abilities, especially within the context of the family, right? We always want to think about that because that's where this learning is going, whatever it's going to look like, whether it's teacher directed, parent supported, or parent led, it's going to be taking place within the home. With that in mind, using those strengths and abilities in order to kind of get to and work on those goals. And so I think it would be really important to start there and always start there, because that's what's going to guide that instruction, right? And the more you know and have a whole picture of that, the better way to possibly go through and be able to support the family in their expectations, right? And asking those questions. Maybe just as you mentioned, maybe there's some high expectations at times, but maybe too low. And how do you kind of work through, well, what are his current abilities? And remember, what's not only what are the current abilities, but what's developmentally appropriate at times and things like that. And so really having those conversations and being able to kind of do that back and forth with the family is going to be important. I think no matter what, again, whether it's asynchronous or how you're doing this, or if it's the feedback you're providing and so forth, but being able to have that rapport and those conversations so that you can help to kind of manage where that is. That's going to be really important, because I think that's where, again, we talked about in the very beginning, those frustrations come out. If we're really taking some complex skills and we're not looking at those current abilities or strengths, or using sometimes those strengths, where things can get kind of bogged down or seem like a barrier. And so being able to look at exactly where Ewan is and what the family's expectations are currently will be really important. I think too, in order to understand like what those realistic expectations, it's going to be different for different situation and a variety of activities. You talked about young Ewan and how you're kind of like managing, this little being that's constantly in motion, perpetual motion. And so really thinking about and being realistic about, are we going to be able to sit down and do a parallel play activity for very long if, what are his current ability levels as far as attention, and are you using those interests? Is it something other than Thomas the Train or something? So really digging deeper, I think, in order to look at, there are going to be times when, maybe the expectation doesn't fit the activity or the ability.
So in a teacher-directed, parent-supported situations, we still have to really think about ways that the family is going to engage their child to even participate in this activity, no matter what it is, no matter what form it takes, whether it's a school broadcast on TV or that live synchronous session through something like Zoom or Google Meet. How is that family going to engage that child and support participation? And as I've said many times, Ewan was either in motion or playing with Thomas the Train and not interested in the things that I wanted him to do. So how would I get him to transition away the thing he really enjoys to doing something that's maybe perhaps not a preferred activity or not maybe first on his list, right? And so I would really need a lot of support in that, even though I knew a lot of things about maybe his communication device, or I knew some good things about autism and some of this using strengths and things like that, using visual supports. I may not have understood fully how to make that transition from a non-preferred activity to a more preferred activity and keeping that child engaged and participating throughout that whole process. And so we really have to break that down and think about a lot of different things as we support this family through this.
So on this slide, you'll see just a few considerations in helping Ewan's family support engagement. Again, we're always going to come back to kind of what are his current ability and goals, right? That's what's going to help to guide instruction. Can't emphasize that enough. So that's always going to be our first consideration. And then, thinking about how do you modify the environment? Talking about you have someone full of energy, maybe a short attention span. How can we maybe, adapt and modify the environment so that it's more conducive to when he needs to pay attention to something, when he's learning something new, or when something's more difficult, right? And so looking at what are some considerations, whether it's cutting down distractions, having a nice, a little learning corner, whatever it is, and helping to consider that. Also, Alicia talks about, you talk about that you felt pretty well versed in utilizing those strengths and interests, and that's not always the case. So that's really a strength, the family strength, and that's important. And how do you kind of continue to encourage that, sort of in those, I would say, like first then activities, right? So you don't want to necessarily transition, but if you can get to that interest again, you're probably more likely to transition to that activity, knowing that you can get your favorites again or your high interests. And so just getting, being able to encourage that more and more throughout activities, and getting and being able to really help understand that that's something that you can use in those transition times, right? Breaking things down. So using that task analysis. And I think, people think of this, for certain scenarios or certain activities, but really, how can you help support the family? And you can perhaps break down whether it's a painting activity or something that has been sent home that you're supposed to be working on. How can you break that down as even further within activities? So not just like this is the schedule of the day and you have some visual supports around that, but really, how can you help to provide instructional strategies that will also help with those visual supports and things. So it kind of, looking at that's more of a complex package sort of training, but how can you help to support engagement and those things that we know are, using those evidence-based strategies and using more targeted supports when necessary, like prompting and reinforcement. And do you know when it's time to prompt, or are you using the same prompt and it's ineffective? Like really helping to support that, because again, those are things that are going to help that engagement and participation and activity and those learning opportunities that you want to occur in order to teach those goals.
And of course, the next thing in a teacher-directed or parent-supported situation is helping families support and recognize communication efforts. Now, I've said a couple of times already that Ewan used the communication device when he was that age. And so I was pretty familiar with that complex machinery at the time, and I knew how to program it and include certain vocabulary and things like that. But we were also working on him and improving his verbal speech. So he was partly verbal too at the time, and we were trying to encourage him to use 2- and 3-word utterances. So really not only the expressive communication aspect, but there was also a lot of receptive communication that we had to work on as well. And while I was pretty familiar with that at the time and would have been pretty comfortable with some of it, I still would have needed a lot of support. And there are a lot of families out there who are going to need a lot more support and who are going to need information really broken down into things that they can understand and use in these situations to help support their child's communication.
So again, in helping the family support communication towards Ewan's goals, again, you just talked about the abilities and goals and where you as a family kind of felt comfortable and what your skill levels were. But I think even more, looking into some guiding questions, will be important. So do they understand and acknowledge communication attempts? I think this is a big one, right? Depending on the level of understanding that a family may have, if you're honoring sort of those approximations towards whether it's, using 2 to 3 word utterances that maybe sometimes, Ewan was using as communication device, it's really going to be important to acknowledge and reinforce, if you will, those communication attempts, right? So that becomes something that, oh yes, I do want to do this, right? And really, I guess, putting emphasis on the importance of that every communication attempt should be rewarded, if you will, or reinforced. So I think that, that's something that sometimes I think kind of falls to the wayside, or just isn't brought to the forefront. You don't realize, oh yeah, there are times when a child might be trying to communicate and I don't mean to, but I don't necessarily provide reinforcement for that, and how sometimes those attempts are so critical in order for a child to really master a skill, right? Practice it and master a skill. Then understanding that how to model all forms of communication. I think that, again, families will be at varying levels for this, right? Do you use different modalities? Are you kind of using nonverbal, communication as well as maybe sign language? Do you, it's one thing, like you said, if you're tech savvy and you know how to kind of put those things into the devices, but, modeling and prompting and doing that whole process of, it's not just we have this device and it's kind of sitting there and now I'm waiting for the child to initiate. How do you kind of sometimes need to make sure that understanding all those different models, modeling all those forms of communication, how important that is to get to those, communication, verbal speech, if you will. And then expanding on communication attempts, like, do the parents expand on that? So again, if Ewan is starting to make, an approximation or a sign with maybe, a few sounds, but it's not a whole word, how do you expand on that? And so I think that these will be important questions that you can pose to a family to find out more and to see just where do you might need to kind of provide some training, and where do you need to give that feedback if you have a video that's uploaded and is showing some communication, what are some possible things? And some of these questions might help guide to some of those discussions and that feedback that you would provide.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to a teacher-supported, parent-led situation. And so one of the things that we really want parents to understand is how that they can embed learning throughout the day in just their regular everyday routines. And so I would have said I was pretty good at some of that, especially when it came to the communication device. Man, I was really good about using that communication device throughout the day. And how do I model using it or encourage you to use that to make choices or to answer questions? But I don't know that I would have been very good about understanding all of the learning that happens throughout the day. I was so focused on Ewan's communication at the time that I really kind of forgot about all the other things. And certainly as a preschool student who's maybe learning from home now, all of the learning that could really happen in almost every interaction and activity that happens in a family's life. And so I probably would not have thought about, beyond the choices of, do you want milk for breakfast or orange juice, and using your communication device for that. I would not have thought about all of the learning that would have happened in, say, cooking activities or getting dressed, or just some of those hygiene routines that we do, just to encourage independence. And so I really think that there's really a lot that we can support and help families understand about the importance of embedding learning throughout the day in just our regular everyday routines.
So in thinking about how to help support embedding those learning opportunities throughout the day, it will be critical to look kind of at what's currently going on, throughout the day within the home and those naturally occurring routines. And again, we really want to think about that quality and quantity, right? So a young child that's working on IEP goals will need a lot of practice. We'll need, multiple learning opportunities. And so how do you do that? Where can you capitalize on that? And again, I think, you bring up a really good point. We talk with educators all the time. It's like, we don't just work on communication during snack time, right? With the AAC device. Where else can we do that? And even thinking about some of Ewan's other goals, right? Following 2-step directions, parallel play. what are some naturally occurring opportunities, and really kind of looking at a day and a daily schedule and a typical, what goes on throughout your home. It will be important to say, where can we capitalize this? And where is it okay to say, and give the family grace also, and say, you know what? It's okay for him to have a break or to work on something independently that he loves to do, right? We're not expecting folks to be in their homes, again, being on as an educator and teach my child through every single part of the day. There are going to be times where you're going to, the family, and looking at those and kind of getting that balance of when do we embed and when do we say, this is a really good time for the child to be independent. And that's important too. It's important that as kids grow up, that they learn to be independent and do something on their own as well. So looking at that and getting the balance will be really important, because that'll look different from family to family. And so I think that's a really good question of where are those opportunities? Where can you capitalize on that? And I think that the other thing is thinking about, beyond that learning packet, beyond whatever the school plan is, where are some other places? Are there opportunities for when you're in your backyard and there's, there's swinging, or there's, you're digging with your young child or something where there's parallel play, but you can also embed, following those 2-step directions and working on 2 to 3 word utterances, or working on the communication device there, and not just mealtime or certain things. I think that really just getting again, a sense of where is this best, but also moving beyond whatever that is, right? Learning, again, you mentioned right in the get-go, parents are a child's first teacher, right? And there are so many ways that can be done, and it doesn't have to just be the way that, was sent to you from a school. How can you expand on that? What can you do in other times throughout the day to help with the learning?
And of course, finally, in a teacher-supported, parent-led learning situation, we've got opportunities where parents can lead instructional opportunities at home. Now, I can tell you there's a lot of things I can do, and I'm pretty good at a lot of different things. And certainly back when Ewan was that age, I felt comfortable with some parts of his life. I don't know that I would have had a lot of confidence in leading some instructional opportunity that has been sent home in a packet, or as an activity that has been added to an asynchronous learning opportunity. So I would say that I would need help, right? I don't consider myself a teacher. I understand the value of teachable moments, and I understand that we are and have always been Ewan's first teachers, but it feels different than the type of teaching that comes from a classroom, right? Like, it feels like there's 2 very different types of teaching, right? And so I think we do have to help families with that level of confidence, and how that this could actually work, and ways that we can support that, from afar. And I think there's some questions that teachers can ask themselves as we move forward in that.
So how can that educator help Ewan's family lead a variety of activities? Again, so we're talking about, the family is working to help support these goals, right? But now they're leading this. They're leading the instruction that's going on with that teacher support, whether it's a learning packet or whatever. So what we really want to look at is, again, those abilities and goals. What are the current abilities, using those strengths and interests, but not just the child's strength and interest. Now we're really talking about the family, right? So if, Alicia, you mentioned being tech savvy and sister was tech savvy, how can you kind of use that, right? Those strengths, also having some knowledge about ASD. And so that really, if you take some of the different strengths and your abilities and so forth, and what are those in order to kind of create that balance and create that confidence too, right? We start with, look at this, you're really great at this. I mean, being a coach, in classrooms, I often do that. Like, look at how great you're doing, you're providing reinforcement or something. So really, again, starting with the positive and building on that, because you can really use those strengths and those abilities to help be the leader of instruction and build that confidence, if you will.
Do you think that like a good example, because Dad says he really likes playing games, so he's tired. Dad says, I'm tired. I just don't see how I could figure out how to help you and sit down in this, live session, but he loves to play games. Do you think that that's something then that we could help Dad feel more confident and address IEP goals at the same time?
Absolutely. And I think that that's where you look at kind of who, in addition to what your family routines and so forth, like who is, I'm more comfortable with this aspect. Like you're more comfortable with maybe the technology, but dad, he's like, I'm, great with wanting to play games. Right. And think of that, back and forth and, turn taking being one of the goals, right? Maybe those are some areas that dad helps to lead that, right? Maybe you work more on some of the, things that might need some of the tech support and things like that. Or, if it's a sitting down and I've got to, do a cutting activity or something like that. But then there are times when you're going to want to work on parallel play and these other goals. And then who could be the leader of that, and use those strengths and abilities of family members, where it makes sense, if you will, for those activities and to work on those goals. I think that's a perfect example of how do you kind of do that and have that balance? Because I think too, when you have different family members, it's really important, what can siblings do when we think about this time as well? And we haven't, but the kind of the peer interactions, yes, you might be doing that, whether it's, through whatever, whether it's Zoom or whatever video conferencing and they can see their peers, but you've got peers within the family, right? You've got siblings and so forth. And so who can also help with that and what are their strengths and abilities? Because I think that will be really important too, to work on some of those social skills, especially doing that with other people when we talk about generalization of skills and things. And I could go on and on about that, but I think that that's really important, is to recognize different family members' strengths and abilities and that balance of who can lead this, who is able to do this and at what time. And again, having that flexibility again, that the parent doesn't have to be on all the time. Is there somebody else that can help support that learning activity instead of the one parent that I've got, I feel like I'm embedding and I'm working on these goals and I'm having to lead. Who else might be the person that leads based on those family strengths and abilities? Really good point.
I think coaching too is where this really kind of all comes together, because we can talk about who's good at this and who's good at that. How can we incorporate this whole family approach to it, and utilizing mom's strengths and dad's strengths and even the siblings in this, and bringing in them to help work on all kinds of things. But I think as a whole, when we talk about confidence, yes, there's a part of using people's strengths, and that includes the families, but it's also about, this is a process. We've talked about this entire framework of parent-mediated interventions and applying it to remote learning opportunities and preparing families to support their children. And so this is not something that's going to happen in a day. It's not going to happen in a week. It might happen over a month. We might start to see families learn more throughout this whole process and become more confident in leading these activities as time goes on. So I think there's something to be said too for preparing families for the idea that this isn't going to be perfect. And it's not going to be perfect right away. And it's a learning process. It's a learning process for everybody, for teachers and trying to figure out how to do this and to make it work, for families, for children who are like, wait a minute, mom's a teacher now? How did this happen? So I think that this is a process. And if we let everybody know that ahead of time, that we're going to get there. We're going to get there together, especially where we have the support for each other and we have the opportunities for learning. I think this is something that we can achieve over time, and that parents are really going to feel better about this as time goes on.
So in talking about providing training and support for families, we know that coaching is an effective practice, right? It's one thing to provide video snippets and so forth, but really that coaching element is really so vital in all of this, because as we said, this isn't necessarily easy. Educators go to school to be educators. We're talking about, how do you take these training and whatever remote situation you're in, and really make for effective instruction so that the child can continue to learn no matter what. And that's really going to be a critical component. We know, in coaching, I've been coached before as a teacher, and I provide coaching for early childhood. And, it's amazing to me, even teachers that are really great at teaching, right? And they know about evidence-based practice and so forth, but having that coaching component, whether, when we look at that whole process of observation and feedback and all of these vital parts of coaching, it's really amazing to me, because I've seen some really savvy teachers, and they know what they have this, like they know what they're doing. And they've said, coaching was so valuable because, and I can fill in the blank with those. But in this presentation, we focused on considerations for that, for whatever situation, whether it's teacher directed and parent supported, as well as teacher supported and parent led. We truly believe, I think, Alicia and I have been doing coaching, and we've talked about Project Pass a little bit, and I'm working on improving practices for young children with autism. And we have seen, very promising data that coaching does really help to make sure that the implementation and the improvement in these evidence-based practices is taking place. So it's a critical element, coaching, when we're talking about educators, but the parent-mediated interventions, parent coaching is going to be a critical component as well.
And I would add, Stephanie, too, that from our experience in this past year with Project Pass, moving towards a virtual and remote coaching situation, that there are some considerations in terms of learning to coach someone remotely. Like, I know, Stephanie, I've heard you say a million times that the way that you develop rapport with teachers is different when you're coaching remotely. And the same thing is going to be true, I imagine, for teachers who are coaching families. So Stephanie, do you have any sort of last words of wisdom on coaching remotely?
I think, it is a shift, right? It is a shift in thinking about how you do things differently, and it is a change. But it's really nice to have that affirmation, honestly, that it can happen no matter what kind of model you have. So we've talked about that. We've sort of had a hybrid model for our coaching that's gone on this past year. And it was a learning curve for me, for sure. But it really helped to, whether we surveyed teachers or whatever we did, that we still found that it was effective. It was different. It was different how we had approached things, whether it was, how you observed or again, getting teachers familiar with some technology that was a little bit different than what they were used to. We weren't just talking about laptops or the platforms that they're used to. And so all of that, it took us, I think, digging deep and deciding what are the evidence-based practices, like task analysis, that we may need to do. We talked about that we provided, if you will, task analysis and visual supports and things like that. And we were constantly, I think, going back to say, what could we add to this, right, to help with that technology piece or how this has changed. And so I think that just knowing that, yes, it's going to take some time, and it is a lot of work, but it's really, I think it's rewarding. And I think it's been very interesting with some more of the e-coaching that we've done, to know that, coaching, if you're using those different phases of coaching and those different parts of the model, it can be done whether it's in person or virtual, right? And so I think that's what's really important about this as we move forward, and how are we going to support families, that coaching component can happen whether it's in person or whether it's remote. So unfortunately, we do not have the time and cannot go into the parent coaching component today in this presentation, but be sure to look at a variety of parent coaching resources that are going to be coming up, including upcoming presentations on the LEADS website. We've provided that link for you on this page, and so more to come, but we certainly are firm believers that coaching is the way to go. So hopefully this will lead to you looking into a variety of coaching resources as they become available.
And Stephanie, I want to thank you for joining us today as we talk about how to apply what we know with parent-mediated interventions and research surrounding evidence-based practices for students with ASD, and applying that to designing some of these unique situations due to COVID-19 and remote educational opportunities. I know this isn't easy, and I know this is just really the first of many conversations about how that we can make this process better, and how we can support families, and how we can support teachers as we move forward. This is not easy. It's not easy for teachers. It's not easy for families. It's really a difficult time. So it's good that we can come together and approach this process as a whole team, and see what we can do to help each other.
Thank you for your time with us today and your attention. I know this was a lot of information. I look forward to seeing all the great things that you're working on and doing in the coming weeks, and wish you the best in the fall.
Be sure to check out VCU ACE for some more resources as we develop them. We're going to keep working through some early childhood topics that might be relevant, and certainly adding to other resources like our how-tos and maybe even some new lunch and learns that we've been doing. So definitely check back at www.vcuautismcenter.org for more resources and information.